Let's bring in now CNN senior political analyst Ron Brownstein and national correspondent for The Hill, Reed Wilson. Good morning to you. And Ron, let me start with you. You've got to ask, now this is day 3 of this feud and this mess from the president. Is he oblivious? We know he watches the shows. Is he oblivious to all this, or is he emboldened by it?
Well, first of all, it's good to be with my old colleague, Reed. We worked together for many years down the hall at National Journal. I would say, look, I do not think this is just random. I think this fits in with the overall strategy and direction of this administration, which is essentially to stoke and mobilize the 45% on a good day that is with him, and to make very little effort to kind of speak to or address the concerns of the majority of Americans beyond their hardcore base. I mean, if you follow the direction on policy choices, whether it's healthcare, which we'll talk about, or environment and climate, or the budget or taxes, all of that is aimed very narrowly in terms of the kind of appeal it has. And the strategy of consistently attacking the media and repeating the arguments about the discredited arguments about widespread voter fraud, these are all, I think, of a piece. This is an administration that has no ambition to be the president of all of America or even a majority of America. They are trying to keep what has been, as I said, on a good day, 45%, in most polls now somewhere around 40%, energized and activated, and that's the way they believe they can survive the 2018 and 2020 elections.
Okay, so Reed, let's play out Ron's theory there. If this emboldens his supporters, what we heard from Sarah Huckabee Sanders is that those supporters elected a fighter. They wanted someone who would fight fire with fire, but they wanted someone who would fight on their behalf, right? How does this feud help them?
Well, I think a lot of and Ron has written about this over the years, and it's good to see you, Ron, that this is a larger sort of confrontation between the elite and the non-elite, the coastal America and the Acela corridor that we look down from our ivory towers, and the rest of America, which is left behind by a recession that has helped big cities while it's hurt rural areas. This is Donald Trump taking on the elite that has overlooked the rest of America. At least that's what he wants his base sort of core supporters to think, and this is a big part of that.
All right, Ron, let's go ahead.
Can I just add, Victor, the place where this kind of runs aground a little bit, more than a little bit, is because the style certainly is that, right? He is presenting himself as kind of attacking these kind of economic and intellectual and media elites on the coast on behalf of his left behind Rust Belt and Mid-American supporters. The problem is the agenda doesn't support that. And particularly when you look at healthcare, the healthcare problem, the core problem is a collision between what the Republican ideology has been and what their coalition has become, because the bill reserves almost all of its tax benefits, literally the income, the health care bill in the Senate and the House, all of the tax benefits on both income and capital gains are for families at $250,000 or above. That's it. But the hardest hit on terms of retracting benefits are for older and blue-collar whites who are at the core of the modern Republican coalition. The Kaiser Family Foundation, you can go on their website, an interactive tool will show you that in every county in the country, except for 2 in Ohio, premiums would go up for a 60-year-old making $30,000 a year, or $40,000 a year, or a 40-year-old making $30,000 a year. And those are the core of the modern Trump coalition.
Reed, let me come to you on health care, because Ron brought it up there. The president floating this idea that if the Senate cannot pass the bill that they're considering right now, that maybe repeal now, replace later. Here's the argument from Senator Ben Sasse.
If we don't get this resolved by the Monday of the next week, July 10th, if there isn't a combined repeal and replace plan, I'm writing a letter to the president this morning urging him to call on us to separate them. If we can't do them together, let's do as much repeal as we can, and then let's have the president ask us to cancel our August state work period and stay here and then work on replace separate.
So the president sent out the tweet floating that idea. You'd expect the president would have known, or at least Vice President Pence, who went to the Hill to try to convince Republicans, Kellyanne Conway, who went up, they would know that there's not enough support to simply repeal and then replace later. So how did it get to the point of an official statement from the president?
Well, not only is there not enough support, but from a legislative rules standpoint, it gets a lot harder if you do the repeal first and then the replacement, because you eventually need 60 votes for certain pieces of that process instead of the 50 votes. And let me tell you, if you're having trouble keeping 2 Republicans around, you're going to have a lot more trouble at keeping all those Republicans and then attracting 8 more Democrats. That's just not going to happen. And by the way, as we talk about a CBO score that was so terrible for the Senate version of the bill that said that 22 million people would lose their health care, what do you think the CBO is going to say about repealing Obamacare? How many people are going to lose their health care then? The Affordable Care Act clearly needs to be fixed in some way, but the Republicans who couldn't stomach 22 million people losing their care are not going to like a CBO score that says that 30 or 40 million are going to lose their care, whatever they say, based on the ACA. But the fact is, Republicans are having a really difficult time keeping their caucus together. There are sort of three factions within the Senate. There's the moderate faction that has tried to pull the bill to the left, largely states that have expanded Medicaid. You've got a sort of leadership faction that's trying to corral everybody, led by Mitch McConnell and John Cornyn, the Senate Majority Whip, and then the conservative faction that wants to uproot the Affordable Care Act, from the bottom, starting with Senator Sass, who you just showed, Ted Cruz, Mike Lee from Utah, and getting all these guys together in one on one package.
It has not been difficult.
Monumentally difficult. And the simple fact is, Mitch McConnell faces a real challenge, and that challenge gets harder if you try to repeal before replacing.
Yeah, it has not been easy at all. Ron, is this a president who just wants to pass something, anything?
I think that's abundantly clear. I mean, first of all, if you kind of think about all the ways in which this, it's hard. I've covered, Washington since the early 1980s. It is hard to think of another bill that does as much harm to a party's core voters as this. I mean, if you look at what it does to older and lower income Americans, particularly those in the last 2 decades before retirement, those are 2/3 of all Americans between 45 and 65 are white, and most of them voted for Donald Trump. But they are the ones who would be hardest hit. If you look at the states that are dealing with the hardest effects of the opioid crisis, West Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio, places like that, they would have declines of 35% or 45% in their Medicaid population. But I think they feel caught between 7 years of promises that they were going to repeal Obamacare and replace it with something better, and the reality that they have not been able to come up with something that would, in fact, be better, despite all the problems that Obamacare is clearly having, that would be better, particularly for voters at the core of their coalition. And I think when you look at the shifting goalposts of the president, it is pretty clear they just want to be able to notch something on the scoreboard. I would say, normally you'd say, okay, well, that's going to give them legislative momentum. This is a bill that is looking at 20% or less approval in public opinion polling. So it's not clear that success is really a better option than failure for the congressional Republicans and the White House at this point.
All right, Reed, let's turn to one more thing here. And this is, I guess, was born out of the president's assertion that 3 to 5 million people voted illegally in the 2016 election. Then he started this commission to investigate voter integrity. We now have the vice chair of that group who's asking the secretaries of state across the country to send him this information about voters. And many of them have said no. The Republican Mississippi Secretary of State told them to go jump in the Gulf of Mexico, and Mississippi is a great place to launch from. The president tweeted this morning. Numerous states are refusing to give information to the very distinguished voter fraud panel. What are they trying to hide? First, the president never offered any support for his claim, but does this give the president and the panel an out to say, hey, we would have shown you the 3 to 5 million, but these secretaries of state are blocking us?
Well, let's begin with the fact that the president's claim that 3 to 5 million people voted illegally is not true and has never been supported. There has never been any evidence offered, and as a matter of fact, every state audits their own voter rolls every year, and no state has found more than a small handful of improper votes. Now, the second part about this, the Trump administration and this election integrity panel, as it's called, has requested everything from the names of voters to their addresses to social security numbers, their party ID, and even how often they voted going back to 2006.
Which is illegal in some states. You can't just hand it over.
In some states, it is illegal. The Secretary of State of Kansas, who is the vice chair, has requested this data. The Secretary of State of Kansas, who is the vice chair, is not able to provide some of that data because, as you say, state law doesn't allow that. A lot of other states, and now look, a lot of this data is public and it's openly available. You or I can go check somebody's voter registration. You can check my voter registration status here in the District of Columbia. It's all public. But the fact is the federal government has requested this. A lot of states, I think we're up to 24 states now, have said, no way, we're not going to give you this data, or we're only going to give you the data that is sort of the
Publicly
most
available.
broadest possible public data. And as you say, the Republican Secretary of State of Mississippi, who is slightly to the right of Attila the Hun, has told him to go jump in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, do one thought experiment here. What do you think would have happened if the Obama administration had asked for this amount of voter data from the states? I can guarantee you there would have been a thermonuclear detonation in states run by Republicans. Now we're seeing both Republican-led states and Democratic-led states.
Probably a major response from then private citizen Donald Trump himself. We got to wrap it there. But Ron Brownstein, Reed Wilson, thanks so much for being with us this morning.
Thank you, Victor.
You got it.